And I've seen the manuscript in the Laurentian where Boccaccio copied out all of Apuleius's Golden Ass in manuscript, and also all of Terence's plays.
Wow.
And both of these are African writers. And so I felt that this was extremely important to stress in teaching.
Yes, yes.
That literature is not only European.
Yes, I think that's absolutely wonderful. How long have you been teaching Terence and Apuleius?
Yes, I love Terence. And Dante's son, Pietro, says that the Commedia is based on Terence's theatre.
Do you think so? Do you believe so? Yes?
It's very clear. I mean, the Roman theatre is circular. And the way Dante's text, it's the circular labyrinth of the theatre. It is a Terentian theatre.
Right. That's what, oh, I'm sorry, I just lost you. I just lost the image. Oh, there we go. There we go. So let me start with an introduction so that people have a sense of what we're going to be talking about. And then I can't wait to hear more about your reading. And hopefully this will be the beginning of something beautiful. Hopefully over the next few weeks, we can all get together and we can get more people coming to talk, not just about rain, but about storytelling, right? And the tradition of storytelling, and how I love that you bring the classic authors into this, because being able to show that cultural and historical continuity across time and across space, I think is incredibly important, because one of the discussions I've been having with a friend of mine is how systems of exclusion tend to delimit themselves either geographically or chronologically, temporally, and then therefore also culturally and ultimately also racially, right? And once they've put people in different boxes that way, once they've set up these different silos, then they not just make the case for discrimination and differentiation, they also then presume that it's axiomatic, right? They presume that that's the way it should be. And so younger generations coming into the system only know what they're presented with. They don't get a chance to understand that this system of compartmentalization and discrimination is actually arbitrary, right?
Yes.
So I'm really, I absolutely love that you're bringing that into the conversation. So let me start by welcoming everyone who is joining us or who will be watching the video feed afterwards, because it's going to be there. This is the very first of a series of conversations that I'm inviting people who have read my book, Rain, to come and have with me. And right now accompanying me is Julia. Oh yes, there's her copy. Julia Bolton Holloway, a wonderful, wonderful Dante scholar, lover of Brunetto Latino, Boccaccio, all things medieval and classic. And so it's going to be wonderful to have her here in conversation. I hope that other people will join us. And if they do, and we need more time, I think we'll be able to afford to do that. So let's see. Let me see if I can, I had plans. Will my plans work out? Let's have a look. I had plans to share a window, and if this works, oh yeah, that's already working actually. Oh, here we go, share the screen. So if this works, then people will be able to see a full screen. There you go. Can you see that, Julia? There, both of us are in the picture too. Okay, fantastic. So I'm inviting everyone to come and visit the website, which is zamanichronicles.net. And there you can find out everything about the book, from the cover, which is designed to represent Africa as an island that is being circumnavigated by ships that bear the symbol of the Order of Christ, which is the order that many of the navigators who followed Prince Henry the Navigator belonged to, including Christopher Columbus and Vasco da Gama. And the series that we're going to be that we're going to be inaugurating today is set up in a number of talks, a number of Saturday talks. Here is a list of the dates each week through October 10th. And the reason why we focused on bringing the main roundtable to October 10th is because one of the driving conflicts in RAIN is the advent and the incursion of the agents of the age of exploration or the age of discovery. In this particular instance, it's represented by Vasco da Gama of Portugal. But in the Western Hemisphere, the most important or the most well-known, most famous, and probably the most damning of those figures is Christopher Columbus, a much vexed and I think very problematic figure historically. Here in the United States, Columbus Day is celebrated, I believe, on the second Monday of October or on October 12th. I can't remember which it is. But October 10th is going to be the Saturday preceding that. And I thought that it would be just appropriate to have that final discussion, which will include other readers of RAIN, including a couple of really wonderful historians, historians of the Middle Ages and of the Renaissance, whose contribution I really look forward to. I think they'll have some really interesting things to teach. Among the resources that I've made available for readers of RAIN, if you go to this page, aside from the calendar, you'll also get a link to a free copy of the book on Kindle. This, once you click on the green button to read through Kindle Unlimited, you can essentially borrow the book as you would in a library and read through it at no cost. I believe that Kindle Unlimited has, if you don't already own it, or if you don't already have a subscription, you can try it free for 30 days. Now, I must tell you that Julia read RAIN in 3 days. Am I right?
Yes.
Yes. So it's I think 30 days is plenty of time to familiarize yourself with the book and get to know the family inside and the adventures of the Dreamwalkers. Now, as you explore the book, you will find a table of contents. And I just very, very quickly, before Julia and I get into conversation, I want to give you an overview of the structure of this book. Because the main protagonist's experience in the world interrogates the idea of time that we are conditioned to receive, i.e. that time passes sequentially from one day to the next in a linear fashion. And yet dreamwalkers don't experience time that way. Dreamwalkers live in a sort of perpetual now, an eternal now. And their ability to distinguish between past and present is entirely dependent upon the memory of their experience, not upon their age, right, in time. And the reason why I chose this structure is because an important part of the book interrogates I think what I believe is an artificial dichotomy between oral history and written history, right? There are quite a few Enlightenment philosophers who put forth the argument that cultures that did not have written histories akin to Western written history were ahistorical cultures. And the reason they put forth this argument is because they wanted to support the idea that European colonizers were destined, had a manifest destiny to subjugate these cultures. So people like Hegel and Kant, and I believe David Hume as well, argued, and especially Hegel, argued that the absence or the paucity of written history in the style of the Western tradition was evidence of ahistoricity, lack of culture, lack of civilization, and therefore made these cultures fair game. Now, oral history, oral tradition functions through memory, right? The transmission of stories, of traditions, of rituals and rites from one member of the family to another, from generation to generation. And the repository of oral history is memory. And so what I thought was to create a story structure that mimicked the way memory functions. Memory does not function in a linear sequential way. Memory is punctual and incidental. And one thought or one idea is catalyzed by the one preceding it, but then which might have then been preceded by something completely unrelated, but not necessarily dictated by the tyranny of sequentiality. And so the experience of the dreamwalkers mimics this punctual nature of memory. One instance there in one moment in time, and another instance there in another moment in time relative to everybody else's experience. And so I chose, therefore, a fairly stable structure for presenting the story, because what was going on inside the story was quite volatile. And I decided that it might be helpful, that it would be helpful to at least offer the listeners of the story a stable structure by which to go. And so the entire tale of Rain is organized into 9 books. And this, as Julia will tell you, is very much in the classical tradition of epic poetry that contained moments, episodes, significant ideas in sets of books. Furthermore, each book in Rain is then divided into 7 cantos. Why cantos? Someone asked me, why didn't you just call them chapters? They are indeed chapters, yes. But the reason I call them cantos is because one of the most significant ways in which oral tradition is transmitted is through song. Whether it be history or folklore, singing and song and musical declamation is a significant part of how oral tradition and oral history is transmitted from one generation to another. It's much easier to remember that way. And this is not something that is unique just to Luo or Kenyan or East African or even African traditions for that matter. All over the world, you'll find oral traditions that are structured around sung delivery. And so, and this designation as canto is not in and of itself superficial. The actual telling of the story is designed to feel like song, right? So that as you read, I've had quite a few readers contact me or communicate to me their surprise at how much they can hear the rhythm of the storytelling's music as it proceeds. Again, all of this drawing from a tradition that I grew up with a great-grandmother who was a wonderful storyteller and who imbued all of us with this very strong sense of linguistic melody and rhythm. So these are the 9 books, and each of the 9 books is divided into 7 cantos. And my hope is that since Julia is also a Dante specialist, maybe we can have a conversation about some of the meaning or the semiotics of this kind of mathematical division. A couple of other things I want to mention before we move forward. In the interest, again, of providing readers with stable structures on which to anchor their experience, the front matter of the book, in this case, you see it in the website, but if you open your copy of Rain, it's right there, right at the very beginning, is I believe a 6 or 7 generation, 6 generation family tree that shows the ancestors and descendants of these 2 family lines, one of them Jokolo, or the people of Olo, and Jokomolo, the people of Omolo, and how the 2 family lines come together at this 3rd generation, if you can see where I'm pointing, where these 2 best friends, Akot and Akongo, make the decision to join their families. Much that unfolds after these 2 generations is contingent upon the friendship of these 2 women and the decision that they made to try and unite their families through their children. So another reason I made this family tree, besides the volatility of the time jumps in the story, was also to give people a sense of orientation about the names. Naming is an incredibly significant part of this story. Naming rituals play a really important role, and names themselves have follow a certain traditional structure among Luo clans. You will often find, I'd say, if I were to ballpark it, maybe 90 plus, 95, close to 97% of Luo names are divided in such a way that men's names begin with O and women's names begin with A. So a girl would be Akoth, a boy, a girl named after Rain would be Akoth, a boy named after Rain would be Okoth, right? Olo is a name that is equivalent to Adam in Luo. And so if Olo had been born a girl, he would have been called Alo. And the same applies to Omondi, Akinyi, Ochieng, Otieno. Simply changing the first letter to A makes it a girl's name. And so you'll find that fairly consistent throughout. It's also a chance for readers to follow generational inheritances. For example, Akoth, who's a memory keeper, Akinyi, who's a dream walker, Ochieng, who's a dream walker, and Hera, who's the mother of the next generation of dream walkers. And here's Maya, who is the principal the principal seeker, the principal quest seeker in this story. She is of the latest generation of this family, but she lives in a world where the traditions have lost a lot of their cohesion because of the incursion that I spoke of earlier of the colonial enterprise that Europe inaugurated around the world. I welcome everyone to take a moment to look at the radio timeline. I won't go too far into that for the moment. Maybe when we have a discussion with a historian, we'll get a chance to look at some of these incidences. This timeline is presented so that one might be able to juxtapose the individual, the intimate family occurrences of the Jokolo and Jokomolo with some of the broader distant occurrences that are connected with especially British imperial incursion. Now, this timeline about the siege of Mombasa has proved very interesting to people who are historians of East Africa. There's a reader who's a professor in Kenya who absolutely loves that I provided this. And from an author perspective, the reason I provided this is because book 7, The Siege of Mombasa, goes through very, very quickly, right? In very rapid succession, the cycle of sieges and occupations of the fort that the Portuguese built where Vasco da Gama landed. And because that is such a significant international landmark right now, it occurred to me that readers might be interested in having a point of reference to know, to look very quickly without necessarily having to comb through book 7 of Rain. Have a very quick look at some of the sequence of events that took place in Mombasa from when Vasco da Gama first landed there in 1498 all the way until I believe it's 2011. I need to add the rest of this to the list, but 2011 when Fort Jesus was declared a UNESCO World Heritage Site. I have provided also a list of a glossary of place names, for the simple reason that many of these places had their names usurped by colonial interests. Namlolwe, which is the center of our story, which is the Great Lake in East Africa, was had imposed upon it the name of Queen Victoria, the first Hanoverian queen in the 19th century. And to this day, it's still called Lake Victoria, but the Luos who live around there, Luos and other ethnic groups who live around there, have their own names for this region. And so I use those names. And then there's some that are indigenous names, like Mount Kenya. Kenya itself comes from a Kamba name for the mountain, which is this beautiful, beautiful mountain right here. It is, I believe, the only structure in the world, the only natural structure in the world where snow falls on the equator. There are actual glaciers on the equator over Mount Kenya. And with global warming, of course, those glaciers are endangered. But one of the most beautiful places, I think, in the world. And then I've included also here some river names that appear in book 5, simply because in the spirit of telling the story from the perspective of the indigenous peoples who lived there, in a sense, as a reclamation from the erasure of the colonial enterprise, I went and found these names as something, for example, like the Mississippi River, whose name translates quite literally into the Great River. And it's considered the sister of the Missouri River, whose name is Umisurita. So these kinds of meta informational material that I provided was just so that the reader might get a chance to anchor their experience of this story in the real world in which we live, and hopefully glean from it a little bit of the flavor, the rich flavor of the human experience in its variety, in its ancient newness, for lack of a better word, right? The fact that so much of what makes human cultures beautiful is older than memory. And so with that, having presented Rain in that way, let me turn back to Julia and see if you'd like to, if you have any questions, if you'd like to add anything to what I just said about the peripheral material.
Well, when you spoke of the 9 books in Rain, this of course is Dante's Vita Nuova, where Beatrice is a 9. And forgive me for bringing in Elizabeth Barrett Browning.
No, please.
She writes the epic poem Aurora Lee in 9 books because it is the woman's number.
Yes.
And I sort of love this way of how we women are subverting the male canon. But Dante even within his own male canon, has
Mm-hmm.
it subverted by Beatrice,
Mm-hmm.
who sends Virgil away,
Mm-hmm.
and it becomes the women's text.
Mm-hmm.
And I've just published a translation by a colleague of mine from Boulder,
Mm-hmm.
where Christine de Pizan
Mm-hmm.
writes the feminist commedia,
Mm-hmm.
where she is Dante, and
Mm-hmm.
she's dressed in blue like the apprentice,
Mm-hmm.
as is Dante in the manuscripts.
Mm-hmm.
And her guide is the Sibyl,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
which is perfect because that had been Aeneas's guide,
Yes, yes.
Virgil's poem.
Mm-hmm.
And so she's done this wonderful feminizing of
Mm-hmm.
Dante's Commedia, and it's
Mm-hmm.
absolutely beautiful.
That's beautiful.
This is the scene. I don't know if we can. We can't.
Okay.
I don't think I'm on the screen.
Let me see. Let
But
me. Actually, you are. And what I can do is I can make your image
okay,
a little bit bigger so that
right.
people see.
It's beautiful because against this blue
There we go.
background, there we go. You see the aged Sybil, like myself,
Mm-hmm.
and the young Christine, who's been left
Mm-hmm.
widowed and has to support her family by writing,
Mm-hmm.
after having as a child the run of the King's Library and all of
Mm-hmm.
his manuscripts with Dante and Boccaccio and the
Mm-hmm.
classics.
Mm-hmm.
And so seeing that this is coming into also in Rain, which
Mm-hmm.
is so much a woman's book, the
Mm-hmm.
story, the
Yes.
protagonist,
Mm-hmm.
and then male as characters, yes, but it's very much a woman's story.
Mm-hmm.
And it's I once wrote a poem because my father had been in India and was a
Mm-hmm.
friend of Gandhi,
Mm-hmm.
and so he was part of the empire but of rebelling against it, in
Mm-hmm.
which I talked about my imperial father to his colonial daughter.
Mm-hmm.
I think in a sense this imperial colonial is also the relation of men and women
Yes,
as
yes,
well.
yes, 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 yes. No, this is a wonderful point. I'd like to complement that by saying, if I can, let me see if I can find that page again. This is, I think this is why people have technicians do this part of the book for them,
Yes.
because otherwise it gets quite tricky. So I'm so glad that you mentioned that this is a women's story, because one of the things that I find interesting, let me start with the Commedia, since that is our common point of reference beyond Rain. I'm right now co-editing a series with Francesco Ciabatoni, who teaches Dante at Georgetown University. And the title of the series is well, the subject of the series that we're editing has to do with the representations of free will and subjective agency in women in Dante and in his contemporaries, right, and his near contemporaries. And so the contributions are wonderful. They're people who are writing their essays are getting a chance to, I think, explore subjects in medieval literature among Dante's contemporaries that I think traditionally have been either peripheral or only very occasional. This entire volume is dedicated to that. There is a composition that is about Christine de Pizan in this collection. And so I'll make sure that I pass that along to you when it's complete. The contribution that I'm making to the collection has to do with Dante's subversion of the traditional tropes of women as lacking in agency or subaltern to men. And he does that in the most gloriously virtuistic way by making Beatrice the principal authority of his poetic enterprise. And he does it in in an incredibly unequivocal manner. He does not hem and haw about it, because besides having her be the one who sets his journey in motion, besides having her be the one who assigns Virgil the task of leading Dante through the first 2/3 of the journey, in addition to her having taken on this responsibility from Lucia, who took it from the Virgin Mary. And so Dante already sets up, it's not, in this case, it wouldn't be triumvirate, it would be a trinity of women, right? A trinity of women who, as Virgil says, watch over him, right? And are essentially his patrons, for lack of a better word. So besides all of that, Dante then makes sure that he underscores Beatrice's authority when the pilgrim first meets her and thinks of her in a simile that equates her to an admiral, right? Quasi ammiraglio che va in prora in propria, right? What's really interesting to me about that simile is, for as long as I could find critical commentary, there was this consensus that Dante was essentially authorizing Beatrice by equating her with a masculine figure of the admiral, right? The underlying premise of this argument being that authority is necessarily resides with the masculine, and therefore, to make Beatrice an authority, Dante had to lend her some masculinity, even if only rhetorically. But my hypothesis is that is not the case. In fact, I don't believe it has anything to do with admirals being masculine. Rather, it has to do with the fact that every poet that Dante has learned from, all of the classic poets of the Bella Scuola, in a tradition going as far back as Hesiod, right? A tradition that Virgil really cultivates very, very robustly. One that Ovid, for example, is obsessed with, and I will tell you what it is in just a minute, and one that Dante himself works very progressively throughout the Commedia at the opening of each cantica, and that is the idea of the poet, and particularly the epic poet, as a seafaring traveler, as a sailor, right? Mm-hmm. And the simile that presents Beatrice presents her as the admiral,
yes,
who is encouraging the sailors each to do their best. Now, in a semiotic or in a semantic field where every poet that Dante has learned from, and then Dante himself consistently presents themselves as a sailor setting off into the wide sea of epic poetry, then to present this one singular figure as the admiral, right, who admonishes and encourages the sailors to do their best, is the most unequivocal way to say that the authority over Dante's poetic enterprise and all of the poetic enterprise preceding him from which he learned is in fact Beatrice, right? And to me, this is one of the most beautiful, it's beautiful in its understated and yet completely unequivocal subversive import, right? That Dante doesn't even negotiate it. He doesn't argue it. He doesn't try to persuade. He simply states it as fact, right? And then proceeds to follow through by having her be the doctor, the iudex, the one who teaches him everything, the one who directs him in every way, the one who corrects the mistakes of Aristotle and Plato, the one who clarifies the obfuscations of St. Thomas and St. Augustine, right? The one who makes theology clear, time and time again, the one whose smile is so brilliant that she withholds it just so that he may not be undone by it. And so with with the Commedia, it, 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 it occurs to me that one of the most interesting overlooked elements of this poem in association with the Vita Nova is how unapologetic and axiomatic, I guess, Dante is in his assertion of the authority of women, right? In a way that it doesn't brook any argument because it doesn't invite doubt, right? So, having said that, in Rain, one of the things that you may have noticed is when the book opens, obviously with Maya, Olo is the first figure who lends his name to the first book, and this is because I guess the entire book leads up to his entry into the story. The second book is dedicated to his daughter Akoth, and readers who do not speak Doluo, which is the language of this family, may not know this, but the story does tell you that Akoth is derived from the word koth, which means rain. And so the name that Olo gives his daughter, Akoth, means rain. Akoth, in turn, later names the youngest child of her grandson's wife, who is Hera. Hera in Doluo means love, right? And so when the mother gives birth to this child, she names the child Love. And when Akoth, her great grandmother, names her, she gives the child her name, Akoth, Rain. And Hera, or Love and Rain together, is the one who then becomes the mother of the next generation, who will then be featured in further volumes of this series. I have 5 series planned. I'm right now writing the second one, which is Wind. And in the story of Hera, you will have noticed, and I'm really interested in hearing your take on this since you are a mother. I was very, very fascinated by the representation of women as life givers, right? And not just in a mythical and symbolic sense, but the real lived experience of what it is to conceive and nurture and birth and raise a child. And so in Rain, Hera becomes the figure who carries this through from the moment you meet her all the way to, I believe, the final page of the book. So let me just concede some time for you, because I can see that you have some some thoughts.
I found it sort of fascinating. You have Maya and her perceptions, and you're reading the book through her, the way when you read the Commedia through Dante. And then you have Hera, who seems to be you. And it's another voice, another perception coming into the text. And I found this quite really fascinating, the way it ends with the birth of the twins. And I don't know if you know Victor Turner's work.
No, I don't.
In the ritual process. He was, I knew him at Princeton's Institute for Advanced Study. He was an anthropologist, no longer alive. But he'd done his studies in amongst the Nembu in Africa. And he was, doing the traditional kinship systems, Levi-Strauss. And he found that the Nembu didn't have very interesting kinship systems. They would excuse themselves and go off. And finally he joined them to find they had this very rich ritual life. And one of the ceremonies is the problem of twins. And in which the adepts who have already given birth to twins help the couple who will be giving birth to
Mhm,
twins,
mhm, mhm,
because it's risky. There's not enough resources, but
mhm,
it's also wonderful.
mhm,
And
mhm,
they're all dressed in white.
mhm,
And it was splendid sort of listening to him telling about this ritual.
mhm,
And so I brought that to Hera's birth
mhm.
of her twins at the end of it.
Uh-huh. That's fantastic. That's absolutely wonderful. I'm curious about why you just said earlier there's Maya and her perception, and then there's Hera who is
Mhm.
you. What do you mean by that?
Well, Hera is a bit of your own autobiography, I think.
Huh,
There she is
interesting.
coming to, to the new world and so
Mhm,
forth.
mhm,
And you often talk about your nostalgia for
mhm,
Kenya.
mhm, mhm. This is true.
And she goes back to her own country to
Mhm,
give birth.
mhm, mhm, mhm.
And so forgive me, I do
No.
feel that literary texts
Mhm.
are autobiographical.
Right, right,
We
right.
we sort of take a kaleidoscope of
Mhm,
ourselves
mhm,
and
mhm,
create these other characters.
mhm, mhm, mhm.
And Dante's text is
Yes.
so
Mhm,
autobiographical,
mhm, mhm.
playfully,
Mhm,
not
yes.
necessarily literally so,
Mhm, 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 mhm.
but anyway, that was the way I found myself reading its ending.
Mhm, mhm. This is so fascinating because this is absolutely wonderful. I was having a conversation with a friend a couple of days ago about the idea of the death of the author, right?
Mm,
Um, and the way I'm experiencing it right now is I don't know if this is how it was meant theoretically, but I'm experiencing it's fascinating. Let me see if I can get us out of here so that we can see each other. There we go, much better.
mhm.
It's fascinating to hear, to receive readers' reception of Rain, to hear what they bring into the text, you know, the life that they breathe into it, and 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 what they imagine as they're breathing this life into the text. Because ultimately, a book is just an object, right? These pages are just paper with markings on them, and the life of the book is quickened the moment a
Mm-hmm.
mind
Yes,
encounters it, right? And begins to conjure, right, the reality that is represented in this object. And
yes.
so,
In fact, you begin it by saying reader, which is the
yes,
way Dante addresses his reader over and over again,
yes,
breaking the fantasy of
mm-hmm.
the text as in a frame, a picture, a distance. You
Yes.
are present in it.
Yes, yes. And so it's been fascinating for me. I've loved the fact that when people read Rain, they will write to me about their reading experience. Sometimes it's a joyful experience. On a couple of occasions, I've had um, I've received emails of people who felt traumatized, especially by book 7, right? And especially the 1-2 punch of book 6 and book 7. Book 6 is the blood of Anatole Basile Tejo, followed by the siege of Mombasa, right? And so beyond the immediate emotional engagement with the story that is told in Rain, I am absolutely fascinated when I hear how readers are engaging with the lives of the different characters. For example, I won't go into specifics, but there's a character whose life, as I was writing it, and I very much feel like a scribe. You know, when Dante talks about la matera onde io sono fatto scriba, I feel very much that way, like material of which I've been made the scribe. So as I was doing my scribal work, writing the story of this particular character, I remember on the one hand being sort of fascinated by her, but also being a little bit a little bit taken aback by her brazenness, by her she sort of barrels through life in a way that in many ways is shocking to me, right? To me as an individual. And yet, one of the first readers of Rain who fell in love with the book and fell in love with characters absolutely adores this character. She absolutely adores her. And I was like, really? And she was telling me about how, yes, I love this woman. She knows what she wants. She goes and gets it. I was like, so that's how you interpret that. What reads to me as I'm scribing away as brazen reads to her as intrepid, right? And enterprising. Absolutely fascinating. And so little moments like that, the comment that you made, for example, when you described this, if I can remember, I got so caught up in your turn of phrase, which I found really beautiful. I should look it up. I should be responsible and look it up. Give me a moment. I will be responsible and look it up, because otherwise I fear that I might not do it justice. Let's see. Where's Julia's comment? I think it was, you called it something like a Milesian discourse in Dantean cantos, from a nilotic reed. There you go. Milesian discourse in Dantean cantos from a nilotic reed. And I thought that was such a lovely turn of phrase, for the simple reason that you as a reader have the broadness of vision to see across time into the classical tradition, into the medieval tradition, and into the East African tradition, all in one gaze. And Julia, that was just beautiful.
I also fell in love with the way you began with Augustine about Charles the Psalm, and that was also your dream walker, and the Aborigine in Australia, dream time.
I'm sorry, say that again?
In Australia, the Aborigine have dream time.
Tell me about it.
To them, our Western linear time doesn't work. And they will go do the walkabout.
Yes.
Living as your characters do, with the ancestors. And then I have a Native American friend who got cross with me when I got cross with the Roma about thinking that they were spending too much money when they were too poor on funerals. And she was saying, no, you must honor the ancestors, which you do in this book, with genealogy. And here I am looking after a cemetery and working out genealogy, so on and so forth, and realizing how important it is, memory. It's beyond time, although it exists in time as well. But if we don't have it, we're so barren.
Oh my God, yes. Oh my God, yes. And this is exactly the allegory of the man made of drought. Because in the entire book of Rain, I believe it was Mary Miliozzi did a review of Rain, and she captured, I think, very, very beautifully, the idea that rain is a symbol and an allegory for life and memory, right? Yeah. And the way the story elaborates this symbol and allegory is that when trauma is when the trauma is too intense, that the world soul just cannot absorb it,
right?
Then it simply stops rain, It stops the circulation of this memory, right? The idea that trauma is mitigated through forgetting, I think maybe is best dramatized in Maya's own experience, right? As her brother actually watches the process develop, right? When she's very violently traumatized. But then this carries forth into other representations of trauma, and particularly the one of the man made of drought who comes into this fertile garden, right? Where life has its equilibrium. And because he's made of drought, i.e., he doesn't have the memory of the land, and yet he is so avaricious for the riches that he finds there that he willfully just gluts himself on it, and in doing so brutalizes the land and its people and releases this bilious flood of blood and bile that completely traumatizes them, not just in the moment but for generations hence. Right? And so that his spirit comes back to keep invoking this idea of drought, not just as the absence of precipitation, but drought as the severing of our link with cultural memory, with the memory of who we are, with the memory of where we come from, with the memory of our kinship to one another, right? And so when you mention that, and this came out of a conversation that I had with yet another reader, right? The notion that memory does and can and should extend in a very in a very vital way, in a living way, beyond the generation of the living, right? It extends to ancestors and it extends to the generations yet to come, right? There's I love that image in I believe it's Paradiso 17. No, Purgatorio 17. When no, is it 14? I can't remember where it is, but when they're talking about the l'anima sempliceta, right? Esce di mano di colui che lo contempla, l'anima sempliceta. The idea that the mind of God contemplates the simple, brand new soul and then releases it into the world. And it comes into the world completely naive and drawn to every pleasure, right? Until such time as it can learn to govern its desires and its impulses. And this is an idea that I find fascinating, not only in Dante, and not only in literature, in the way it manifests in Rain, especially when Hera is thinking about how if she had a girl, then the girls would have been here already, right? Eager to share their knowledge about what God told them, right? While they were being sent to Earth. But also with my nieces and nephews, when I see young children, when I see babies born, I'm fascinated by the idea that they experience this world as a beginning, sort of tabula rasa, as it were, and yet they are making the world as they experience it, right? So for a 3-year-old, the universe is 3 years old, right? For 6-year-old, the universe is 6 years old. But as they grow and the longer they experience it, the more they accumulate the memory and the experience of time of others around them, right? And so their conception of the age and the breadth of the universe grows geometrically with every new encounter, right? But at the beginning, it is just as old as their perception of it is, you know? So this is wonderful, this notion of the connection between ancestors and living and those yet to come, right? Which ties back to St. Augustine again, right? The idea
Yes.
of
I think, I'm not sure if this is going to be the
oh,
it's the hymn that
uh-huh.
Augustine describes being about to sing, then singing, and so forth.
Oh my goodness. What is it
And
called?
it's Giacomo Baroffio's
Uh-huh.
Gestistius that I had the recording and I loved it, and he allowed me to put it on the web.
Could you email me the link to it so that I might listen?
Yes, well, it's a web essay called August in on Umiltanet,
Okay.
and it's on Augustine and Boethius and
Uh,
time and so forth.
okay.
But I love the music,
Oh.
and, but it's that a splendid way of thinking about being, and
Mhm,
then executing it, and then remembering having
mhm,
done so,
mhm, mhm, mhm.
as analogy to God's creating of the world,
Yes, yes.
and how we, in a sense, are miniatures of God everywhere.
Mhm, mhm.
So,
This is so wonderful.
I have loved also your aspect of storytelling. And when I talked about how this reminds me of Apuleius,
Mhm,
we put together this book, which
mhm,
is called Tales Within Tales,
mhm.
Apuleius Through Time. And it was the
Can you hold it up
scholars.
again?
Okay, right.
Let's see. Ah, yes. Okay, go on.
And at the end of it, we have a Hispanic woman telling the story. We have a gypsy orphan telling her story.
Mhm,
These are real women telling real stories about their
mhm,
lives. And Leslie Silker,
mhm, mhm,
before she wrote her, well, she ended up writing a dreadful potboiler, but she wrote some wonderful books as well. But
mhm,
before she wrote those, she gave a paper at Harvard
mhm,
on our storytelling in
mhm,
her Mesa,
mhm,
which is the same story as Cupid and Psyche in
mhm,
Apuleius,
mhm, mhm,
consolation story where the mother has lost her child.
mhm,
And I've lived with Roma gypsies who are
mhm,
absolutely despised in Italy,
mhm,
treated very badly, and
mhm,
considered to be without culture and so
mhm.
forth. And I've been recording Diamanta's stories, and they are wonderful. She has a whole library of oral
Fantastic.
tales, which are King Lear and
Mhm,
so forth. They're all the great stories.
mhm.
And she is orally literate to
Yes,
a
yes.
very great extent.
Mhm,
And so I've been finding this very humbling that I love being able, as a professor who works with manuscripts and so
mhm,
forth, to
mhm,
live with and appreciate as an equal
mhm,
someone who is illiterate but
mhm,
has this vast culture,
mhm,
which
mhm.
is better than mine.
Mhm, 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 mhm. And incredibly deep, right? Incredibly deep. So deep that you lose sight of where the roots reach, right? And I think this plays back into the idea of the limits of the conception of time as a sequential thing that you can date,
Mhm.
right?
Right.
Because the depth of the depth of the storyteller's culture that you describe, right?
Yes. Mhm.
If someone tried to date it, you know, sequentially date it or carbon date it or whatever, I think they'll be frustrated in their effort
Yes.
because it would go on for infinity, really, right? As far as they could trace it, and yet it is so very present in the now.
Yes.
You know,
Mhm. Yes.
this is something which I I personally wonder about. I'm so fascinated by the parallel that you do with Hera, and now it comes back to mind for the simple reason that you know, the moment when she's in the cathedral listening to the evensong, both at Westminster and particularly at Canterbury, right? These I did draw from personal experience because
yes, it comes through.
and what's fascinating to me about that part of the story, and again, I'm now speaking as a reader, as a fellow reader with you, right?
Yes.
Rather than as the scribe of the story. But what was fascinating to me about that experience, of the two of them together, and especially her perception and her understanding that her sister would perceive it differently, right? And all the memories that it evokes, is how it is all happening in this petrified forest, right?
Yes.
In this stone mausoleum to saints and kings, and the idea that especially in our broadly westernized um, cultural hegemony, the notion that honoring history manifests as petrifying, as setting it in stone, rather than breathing it, rather than, you know, living it the way you describe the storyteller living that history, right? And so what's fascinating to me when I read Rain, because I'm still reading it, like I'm thinking this is an interesting story, right? Is that moment, and this is how I know that this is how I know that I'm a scribe, right? Rather than an author, right? I know that I'm a scribe because when I read Rain, I learn things, right?
Yes, yes.
And one of the things that keeps surprising me is how often Western history manifests as stone, as petrified, as immobile, right? And
And the
how
statues in Lisbon of
there you go.
Prince Henry. I mean, they're
Yes.
magnificent, but they're terrifying at the same
Yes, exactly. And they're lapidary. I mean, talk about boom, just
time.
and the notion that I think there's a moment, I was reading this a couple of days ago, a moment when they describe the Hanoverian queen. When the Hanoverian queen died, the craftsmen of her land turned her into stone, right? In my travels through London, I've always been fascinated by how many stone sculptures of Queen Victoria there are. They're all over the place. And not just her, but European monarchs get transformed into stone, you know, all over the place. The ones that me personally horrify me the most are the Belgian ones, right? And particularly because of my awareness of where the wealth to build these monuments came from.
Yes, yes.
A student once asked me, I teach French in university, and a student wanted advice about education abroad, where he might go for a French program. And as we were discussing it, we talked about the different options, because I told him that it depended on what kind of experience he wanted to be primary, right? Was he interested in the cultural flavor of the place, or was he much more interested in just a linguistic grammatical experience? And and then if that were the case, then what kind of language experience was he looking for? And he was very open, so he didn't have any constraints at the moment. So as we went through the different francophone regions where he might go, from West Africa to some of the to the Caribbean areas, and even to France itself and Switzerland, I didn't realize that as we were enumerating all these places, Belgium never showed up. And at one point, because I'm at GWU, which is a sort of a feeder school for the State Department, Brussels figures largely in the imagination of the students. So he asked, "And what about Brussels?" And in that moment, I kid you not, but I pictured that arc that Leopold built. He built several palaces, and there's this very famous triumphal arc. But I pictured it with this flood of blood washing through it.
Oh, right. Mm-hmm.
That's what came through my mind. And once that came through my mind, it washed over all of Brussels and then went into the Belgian countryside, and especially to the palaces that Leopold built for himself and to the glory of his father. And I found myself negotiating, how was I going to speak to the student about Belgium, right? When this was the idea that was flooding my mind at the moment. And so what I chose to do in that moment was to tell him, I hadn't thought about Belgium because I think thinking about Belgium terrifies me a little bit. The history of what they did in the Congo feels too real to me,
It's Conrad's Heart of Darkness.
There you go. And so I couldn't recommend Belgium for the simple reason that unless he went there and was able to see the blood spattered over everything, the blood of severed limbs, of broken bodies, of ravaged land, the blood that paid for all of this, all of these tourist attractions to be built. If he could stand to walk through that, then he should consider investigating further. But I told him honestly that I couldn't recommend that because I don't know, in my soul, it feels like abetting a crime to send tourists to spend their money in a place that was built with that kind of blood money, And Belgium is not the only place. I mean, this is all across Europe, but that was particularly present in my mind. And it may have been because I've been reading so much about Leopold that I was having nightmares about him.
And you remember how Conrad begins Heart of Darkness. They're on the Thames.
Mm-hmm.
And he says, this is one of the dark places of the world. He's doing the analogy with Britain and Belgium. It's also my own country, which was capable of atrocities.
Is to this day. I what do you make of that? What do you make of the blithe sort of indifference, for lack of a better word, or complacency?
We don't teach history correctly. We falsify it. My family background is Anglo-Irish, and so I know the history of Ireland, but the English don't. But the English did it, and it's a history of genocide. And I see this horror of the blindness, which Conrad is very good at getting at in Darkness. I think it's an extremely important text to teach.
My hope is that when people read Rain, and especially those people who have told me that book 7 traumatized them, right? I believe that you mentioned that up to that point, until you got into book 7, the
Yes.
poetry of Camões had.
You have romanticized Vasco da Gama until you get to that point, and then it's such a shock when you realize the Orwellian opposite. It's the contrary of what you had thought it was.
Exactly. And it's I think it's a shock to everyone. I know from my contemporaries, the people with whom I went to school when I was a child. I went to boarding school in Kenya, and we all constitute a very close-knit community, even to this day. I mean, we're all approaching middle age, and yet we're all still friends, which is fantastic. And I mean dozens of us, right? It's been interesting sometimes, and especially last summer when I was wrapping up writing Rain, and I know in the spring when I was in sort of elbow deep, especially in Mombasa and in Calicut, right? And I would bring up to my fellow former classmates, my contemporaries, my friends. I would bring up questions about, how much do they know about this history? How much do they know about Vasco da Gama? How much do they know about, and to your point about the way history is taught, it's not just to the English that it's taught wrong. I think the operation that Camões executes, that of lionizing these brutal terroristic figures, right? Because of their service to the crown, right? Or in the interest of creating a sort of a national mythology, is one that is repeated time and time and time again. And it's fascinating to see how deep the roots of that mythology is, even among people who have been on the receiving end of its cruelty and brutality, right? It's fascinating to see either the lack of awareness or understanding of the brutality of a figure like Vasco da Gama, or the other extreme, which is a defense of, but he was an explorer, coming from fellow Kenyans, right? Coming from, I don't know if there are any Indians who would say that about him. But I know, for example, that there's a historian, a Kenyan historian, who I posted a video of him talking about Vasco da Gama. Well, no, he was talking about the history of Mombasa. And in a passing comment of this friend of mine who teaches in Kenya is the one who sent me this video. In a passing comment, he says, oh yes, Vasco da Gama, they talk about him as being this intrepid explorer who opened up the path to India. But the man was a terrorist, brutal personality, right? And this was this is a historian in Mombasa who's saying this. He's speaking Kiswahili. My colleague from Nairobi had sent this to me because she had, in the space of about a week, she had been reading book 7. She's the one who told me that she was traumatized by it.
Yes.
And then she happened across this video in a completely unrelated context. And so she has that same idea echoed that she had just been reading about. And then she also happened to hear a conversation among 2 people who were talking about traveling. And the name Vasco da Gama caught her attention, just because it wasn't a conversation she was part of, but the name caught her attention. And because it caught her attention, she listened, and she heard them lamenting the cruelty of his enterprise, of his terrorism, I guess. So when she wrote to me about it, it was for her, it was this interesting moment of convergence.
Yes.
Of completely unrelated situations that were all conspiring to say the same thing to her. We mused about what the universe might have been trying to tell her, and her response was, I don't ask, I dare not ask. But given the times that we're in, given current events, given the wave across the world of people toppling the monuments and statues of slave traders, slave owners, terrorists like Vasco da Gama, like Columbus, Confederate generals, and all these kinds of figures, it is, it's quite, I don't know what the word is. It's a little bit overwhelming to also be presenting this book into the world in this moment when it is, there's an element in the book that focuses on the particular story of one of these individuals, that now we see all of the world being confronted for the history that they lived, but that was nevertheless whitewashed by the Camoins of the world, by the, and not just the poets, but also by the historians of the world, right? And by the politicians and by the, sadly, the teachers also, you know?
Yeah.
So.
Well, I think the tragedy is that it's such a temptation to go where there is power, and the power is held through violence, and we have to negate that to accept what we're doing morally. But what I find so important, you wrote this book. Women did tend to write books against this male history, and that she is buried here, Frances Trollope. She publishes this in 1853. She journeys up the Mississippi River. She sees slavery firsthand. She's shocked by it. So she writes a novel against it, and it's a wonderful novel.
Can you hold it up so that we can see it?
Okay, it's called Jonathan Jefferson Whitlaw. And it's available on Amazon. Trollope Society and I just published it. I kept saying, we need to get this back in print. It's so topical. She's a better writer than Anthony. But it's so topical because that cover picture is of a lynching. And in the novel, it's actually the white teacher who teaches the slaves to read and write, who is lynched by the kind of Trump figure who is against the slaves having any access to power. And it's a wonderful novel. She's got this absolutely splendid older slave woman whose mistress had taught her Shakespeare. And she has to, when she needs to control Jonathan Jefferson Whitelaw, who is this anti-hero from Henry Fielding's Jonathan Wild, a figure of a criminal who is exactly Trump. And she pretends to be mad and spouts Shakespeare. And makes everyone believe that she has magical powers. And she's magnificent. I think we need women like her.
Yes.
We need strong voices. And this is what I love about Diamanta's stories. In her stories, they're moral stories. And young girl who is kind to the animals will then be helped in traumatic situations. But her mean, wicked sisters who are cruel will meet with a cruel fate. I think in a sense we do need this kind of guidance, that there's behavior which is not acceptable. It will lead to the wrong kind of society. And there's this other kind of behavior which is the Italian word condivisione. It's collaborative, it's humane, which will lead to the good society. And I think it's time for women's voices. This started to happen in the Victorian period. The governess novels, women who couldn't go to university but were hiring themselves out as governesses, then
mm,
writing novels like Jane Eyre and
mm,
so forth. That was where we were breaking into the world of education. And I think we need that. I'm so grateful to you for doing Jane.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much, Julia. Thank you so very much for reading it. Thank you so much for joining me in this conversation. And thank you so much for all those books that you mentioned. If you wouldn't mind sending me a list of them, I will add them to the post so that others might see. And I'll find the links to Amazon, right?
Right.
But I'll add those to the post so that anyone
Yes.
who listens to us talking, if they're interested in getting those books, then they'll have a direct link to them. I'll look for other bookstores as well, because I know there's some people who don't like purchasing from Amazon. So please do send me the list of the titles and the authors. I will include them in there. Then that way, whoever comes to listen to this conversation later has a chance to deepen their familiarity with this tradition. And ultimately, it is about storytelling, and it is about, I think, the power of engaging one another through the imagination, through language, right? Through art and craft, and rather than, as you said, through the power that exerts itself as violence, right? Power that seeks to destroy and to subdue. On that note, I want to add one more note about Dante, one of the most beautiful passages in the Commedia. And I think I should have I should bear the humility of actually looking at the text while I read it, because it's so beautiful. I'm sure you know the one I have in mind. It's in Paradiso, in Canto, is it Canto 19? I believe it's Canto 19. Yes, Canto 19. When the pilgrim is in the sphere of justice, and the entire discourse around that area has to do with what is the nature of divine justice, right? There's some what sounds like boilerplate discourse about the inscrutability of divine justice and how human minds can't quite grasp it. But Dante, being Dante, he doesn't just stop at the bromides, right? He doesn't just stop at, oh no, this is too complex for poor human minds to understand. He delves deeper and offers, I think, one of the most sublime and also one of the most challenging ideas about power, about love, about justice, all combined together, that I've ever encountered. Now, if only this text would appear while I'm unspooling my preamble. It's the same scenario where when the pilgrim, still confused, asks, or not asks, but rather the eagle reads his mind, right? And reads that he is wondering how it is that, what if, heaven is a place for the blessed, and being blessed, being, ending up in heaven in this universe, can only happen if you're Christian. So one has to be Christian to end up in paradise in the universe of the Commedia. Now, Dante, from the very, very, very first canto of Inferno, actually, and then from the very first circle of hell, he's been deeply troubled by this imperative, right? Deeply, deeply troubled by the imperative that if you are not Christian, you cannot go to heaven, right? And a lot of his trouble at the beginning is anchored in his devotion to Virgil, right? Because he understands that Virgil is damned for eternity. when Virgil first tells him, I will only take you so far, and then I can't go beyond that point. This is in the first canto of Inferno. And then when he ends up in the first circle of hell, which is limbo, and he understands that all these noble pagans, these virtuous pagans, have no hope of salvation, even though they did not sin per se. They did not, the only sin was that they did not love God rightly, as it were, right? And so, let me see if I was, let me see, just give me a moment to open this. So, Renu, I'm sorry, the internet is very, very slow. Maybe if I just picked my my actual paper text, then I wouldn't have to worry about the internet. It's always, page is always so much better than.
But I love it the way Trajan keeps coming in. He's
Yes.
there in Purgatorio 10,
Yes.
and again in the Eagle.
So it looks like I'm gonna have to use this text, because the internet is quite slow when we're connected to the internet, but when we're connected to Zoom. And so I believe it is
and it's interesting that the story of Trajan and the widow
tell
in
me.
Purgatorio, a woman is able to stop the entire Roman army and to get the emperor to administer justice.
Yes. Oh,
and
here we go.
It gets repeated in Elizabeth Barrett Browning, and it gets repeated in Emily Dickinson. The soul selects the society, and shuts the door, and moves she lives an emperor on hello mat.
Oh, fantastic. Send me that also, so I'll put it up there, and then people can read that one too. These are wonderful allusions, I think, literary allusions that I know that I would love to be able to go back and revisit. So the one that I'm thinking about is, once he's asked about, or once the blessed spirits have articulated his doubt, which is, someone is born on the banks of the Indus, right? And he never knows Christ. He never hears the story of Christ. Where's the divine justice that condemns his soul, right? Even if he has lived a virtuous life, a perfect life, right? And this is where the discourse begins to feel or sound like it's the standard, well, divine justice is inscrutable. But like, as I was saying, Dante goes beyond that, right? Because then he presents not only Trajan, but curiously enough, Ripheus, right, as one of the saved souls. I always find commentary, like the commentary tradition on Ripheus, and even the scholarship, a little bit amusing, for the simple reason that many people scratch their heads and go, wait, was Dante just trying to be polemic? Was he just trying to be, just throw a monkey wrench into the works of things? Now, with someone as deliberate as Dante, I think it's irresponsible to simply dismiss a gesture like that as him being cheeky or difficult, right? What I believe is happening is Ripheus, who is mentioned or seems to be mentioned only in passing in the second book of the Aeneid, is actually mentioned at very important moments during the fall of Troy. His name appears in that moment when Aeneas calls the youth of the city to defend their home and the home of their families. And Ripheus, among some of the other young men, answer the call, no questions asked, right? The next time his name shows up is when they're all being shown in a skirmish, right? In the thick of conflict. And the last time his name is mentioned is 200 lines after it was first mentioned, right? 200 lines when it is being recounted that he, among all the others, youth, fell, right? They fell to the Greek swords. And I think the commentary tradition has been perplexed by this seeming peripheral character suddenly finding himself in the eye of the eagle of justice. Like, what How could this figure, who is not only pagan, but also a fictional character, like a poetic invention, how is it that he is exemplary of a blessed soul if this is not just a sleight of hand by Dante to throw people off? What's fascinating to me, Julia, is that when I read the very last thing that Jesus said to his disciples before he was captured and taken to the stockade, as it were, the very last thing he did was to wash their feet, prepare them for the Last Supper, and to tell them to love each other as he has loved them. For no greater thing, no greater love can a man show than to lay down his life for his brother, for his fellow man. And I thought to myself, so this is how Jesus Christ is describing a Christian. The person for whom not even their life is too high a price to pay for the sake of kith and kin, right? This from the New Testament, I think it's John chapter 12, and it's mentioned a couple of times. So if this is Jesus' definition of what a Christian is, right? Someone who will lay down everything, including their life, for another. This is exactly what Dante fishes out of the Aeneid, a figure who, when called upon to defend others, without asking questions, lays down his life and does so. And in this sense, then Dante makes, I think, one of the most eloquent and understated cases for the idea that Christian does not mean a card-carrying member of a sect. Christian does not mean a ritualized initiate into a tradition. Christian, in the tradition of Jesus of Nazareth, is someone for whom the well-being of others is paramount above all else, right? The perfect ethical altruist for whom not even life is too high a price to pay. And in that context, so in the context of all of this discourse, this is where the eagle describes the love of God, right? The foundation of divine justice. I'll say it in English because I think it'll be easier for the audience. The kingdom of heaven suffers violence from the ardor of love and living hope, right? Which in turn, so this assault of love and hope, right, from earth, right, then conquers divine will. Not the way man subdues his fellow man, but conquers because it wants to be conquered. In other words, let me read it in Italiano and then we can go back. Regnum celorum, violenza parte da caldo amore e da vive speranza, che vince la divina volontate. Non agguisa che l'uomo all'uomo sobranza, ma vince lei perché vuole essere vinta, e vinta vince con sua benignanza. So the love of God is like subjects itself to being assailed by love and hope, and lets itself be won, conquered in that way, and being conquered in turn conquers. It is the most incredibly counterintuitive description of divine love I'd ever heard, and yet the most perfectly sublime, because it is completely consistent with a universe in which God creates the soul with free will and then lets that will exercise itself without constraint so that it may choose to return. And should it choose to return, then it is victorious right? In conquering the divine love. And if it chooses not to return, then it has a place far away and removed, right, from that which it has repudiated. I can't remember why I kind of got into this, but it sounded to me like it felt at the moment like the perfect place. Oh, I remember why. Because we're talking about the contrast between power that exerts itself in violence versus power that nurtures in love, right? Power that receives and nurtures and multiplies through love. And so I think with that, we can wrap up. I hope that you have a few last words to offer, and then we can say goodnight.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Julia.
Thank you.
It's wonderful to see you. So I'm going to stop the recording now, and then I'm going to upload this. And thank you so much. Okay. Bye. And